That said, let's get to the main event. Dr. West, he's one of our favorite behavioral scientists. He's a superstar at membership events. He's done more office hours, I think, than any of our team. And he's always fun to talk to, even today, Colin. So if you don't know Colin, let me tell you a little bit about him. He's a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Toronto, Rotman School of Management. He conducts incredible research in behavioral science with a focus on economic decision-making and psychological well-being in the workplace. His PhD is from the UCLA Anderson School of Management, and his bachelor's degree is in social studies from Harvard College. Colin's, even though he's Canadian, he's come down to the States to get his education. I will not tell Justin about this, Colin. It'll be between you and me. I won't let him know you would abandon Canada, at least temporarily. I know you're thinking about what to say. Don't do it. Don't do it. I'll finish. But his research investigates how our resources of time and money shape decision-making and well-being, from droughts to diseases to bonuses and vacations. Periods of scarcity and abundance provide a critical window into human judgment, decision-making, suffering, and most importantly, flourishing. Prior to his PhD, Colin worked as a consultant and researcher applying behavioral science in business and policy settings at BE Works, a Toronto-based consulting firm dedicated to applied behavioral economics, and at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, a US nonprofit based in Nairobi, Africa. So this is, this was a membership talk he did like 6 months ago. It was so well received. We're like, yo, let's make this an open event. So Colin, enlighten us. Take it away.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, I'm gonna share screen. Okay, really excited to be talking with all of you today. And I'm going to tell you about windfalls of time and money. Windfalls are when we get some resource that we don't expect. So often we focus on how to handle shortfalls in our lives. We focus on managing scarce resources, how to cope with the stresses of being too busy or not having as much money as we might like. Today, in this talk, I want us to think about the opposite, how we handle windfalls, moments when we might feel a temporary abundance of money or time. And I'm going to make the case that these windfall moments say a lot about us, and how we handle them is really critical for both our psychological well-being and our economic well-being. So this talk I'm going to tell you about is some research I did with my collaborator, Ashley Willens from Harvard Business School. And this was published in 2 scientific articles, one in Nature Human Behavior and another one in Nature Scientific Reports. So as I go, please interrupt with questions. I'd like this to be more of a conversation, and I want to hear your thoughts. So you can do that in the Q&A, you can pop something in the chat, and then you can please feel free to jump in with your questions as well. So I'd like to begin with a thought experiment. So take a moment and imagine that you came across an unexpected $1,000. How might you spend this money? How would it affect you? Next, I want you to think about you came across an unexpected 10 hours. How might you spend this time? How would it affect your stress and your well-being over the next week? And think about those 2 different types of windfalls and how they might affect you. We actually come across these windfalls all the time in our lives. You think of windfalls of money, well, stimulus checks during the pandemic certainly were a windfall that a lot of people received. Bonuses, commissions and tips, stock options, investment returns, and gig economy workers get this all the time. You know, their income is fluctuating from week to week and month to month, and they're experiencing both shortfalls and windfalls. And the same is true for windfalls of time. Shift workers, often they have more work than they expect or less. They're getting windfalls of time week to week. Contract workers face similar fluctuations. And then during the pandemic, you know, we all experienced a windfall of our time. All of a sudden, we no longer had to commute to work. We got this windfall. How did it affect our lives? And one thing that I've found in a lot of my research is that product designers and policymakers often have a really hard time predicting how people respond to windfalls. Our intuitions about how people are going to react are often way off the mark. And one area where people have especially poor intuitions related to windfalls is in poverty alleviation programs. And by this, I mean providing economic assistance to help lift people out of poverty. The most common types of poverty alleviation programs in the world right now provide money or food or assets like agricultural inputs or business inputs. So this is the context that I'd like to focus on for the talk today. So this is an aerial view of Kibera. This is the largest informal settlement in Africa. It's got a population of about 300,000 people, and it's mostly people living in pretty severe poverty, earning an average of $2 per day. Tons of economic assistance programs operate in Kibera, trying to help lift this population out of poverty. They provide windfalls of cash, of goods and assets, but most have been pretty ineffective. A major challenge is how to design more impactful aid programs that can have a lasting effect and increase people's chances for economic advancement. So here in Kibera, the most common forms of economic assistance are food aid, education and job training, and then asset transfers. And I chose to focus on this challenge for a few reasons of how to improve these economic assistance programs. One is because they've been so ineffective. Billions of dollars are being spent and it's not having much of an impact. There's also a lot of misconceptions about the barriers towards economic mobility in places like this and why some programs work and others don't. People tend to have, the policymakers who operate here tend to have a very narrow focus on material constraints. There's an assumption that if people are financially poor, as those people in Kibera are, they must have a lot of idle time. And I'm going to show you in this research that that assumption might not be well-founded. And also a lot of the research in behavioral economics, behavioral science has focused on what we call WEIRD population. WEIRD is an acronym for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. And there's a lot less research on populations like this in Kibera that are not WEIRD. So, and lastly, you know, I know a lot of the folks on this Zoom work in tech, and I think this is an especially important population for us to think about, those of us working in tech. This population is rapidly adopting smartphones and getting access to the internet for the first time. They tend to be really early adopters of new technology. One example of that being digital financial services. So most people living in Kibera don't have any formal bank accounts, but nearly everyone uses digital money and digital savings and credit accounts. So when we think about our role as building new digital products, we want to think about how we might build digital products for this population and helping them manage the windfalls of time and money that they face. So to address this challenge, I ran a series of studies in Kibera. And I did this with a few collaborators. First was Ashley Willens, also with the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, and with the Human Needs Project, which is a nonprofit based out of Kibera. And we began this research with a hypothesis that economic assistance programs were not paying enough attention to the time constraints facing their recipients. We reviewed the major economic assistance programs in this area, and we found that none of them paid much, if any, attention to recipients' time. And they also often impose time costs on the recipients when they're accessing aid. People have to travel long distances, they have to pick up food aid, wait in line and fill out paperwork. And I'll give one kind of story about that when I was living over in Kenya. There was a large US food aid program, one of the largest economic assistance programs in the area. And it was well-intentioned. They're providing a lot of food to people living in poverty, and they're investing a lot of money to provide this food. However, they didn't invest any money in trying to save people time. In fact, they often intentionally impose time costs. And what I mean by that is they would impose time and effort cost in order to target the poorest households. And this is a strategy that's actually quite common in economic assistance programs that is called self-targeting. And the idea is that the poorest people, that only the poorest people would be willing to incur large time and effort costs in order to receive food aid. And this does work. So if you make it difficult to acquire, you make people wait in line, you make people travel, you make people fill out forms, that it actually does deter richer people from applying. However, this strategy of self-targeting might undermine the effectiveness of the aid program by providing one resource, in this case, food, while taking away another important resource, time. I'd like to also point out that this isn't just an issue in developing countries. In the US, for instance, most economic assistance programs impose huge time costs on their recipients. There's a couple examples on the screen here. People often have to wait in line to access food stamps benefits. This is one such line in Brooklyn. And on the right side of your screen, I've taken a snapshot of the Medicaid application. This stresses me out just to look at it. It's 31 pages long, and you can imagine how much of a time burden this imposes on people trying to access Medicaid. We also see time costs accumulate in our working lives. Administrative work often builds up unaccounted for. So think about your job. What types of small time costs tend to accumulate? And most companies impose a lot of admin work on their employees, and they don't do a great job of tracking these time costs, assessing the costs and benefits of it, and thinking of ways to invest resources to reduce these time costs. So there's very little measurement of time costs in economic assistance programs. None of the major impact evaluations that we looked at over in Kenya had a rigorous analysis of the time costs and savings. So it certainly seems like policymakers are neglecting the time constraints in the design of economic aid programs, perhaps undermining their effectiveness. So I wanted to check this hypothesis. So firstly, what I did was I conducted a pilot study with some people who had some expertise in allocating resources. This was with Masters of Public Policy students at the Harvard Kennedy School. So these are people who are going to be the future policymakers. And I asked them to imagine that they were consulting for a nonprofit aimed at increasing the well-being of working mothers in Kibera, a population that's both cash poor and time poor. And we asked them, how would you allocate 2,000 Kenyan shillings, about $20 US per recipient? And they chose between one of three different aid programs: a cash program, an in-kind aid program where you provided them with food and household goods, or a time-saving program. So I'll pause here and see if anybody wants to pop in the chat what they think the Masters of Public Policy students chose when I asked them. Did they choose the cash program, the in-kind aid program, or the time-saving program? Okay, I won't bury the results on you here. Almost everybody chose the cash program. We have found that 87% of people chose cash, 13% chose in-kind, and no one chose the time-saving program. So this poses an important question. Are these policymakers and aspiring policymakers neglecting time constraints? Is this warranted? Should poverty alleviation programs allocate more money trying to save people time? So this became the central hypothesis for the research. We predicted that providing windfalls of time might be an especially effective and overlooked method of improving the economic and psychological well-being for people living in poverty. And to tackle this challenge, I started with a framework to help guide the research that my colleagues and I did over there. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to make the point that I think it's really important to have a guiding framework to make sure that you're defining your aims in ways that are measurable, understanding the context and not jumping straight to solutions, evaluating the different ideas that you come up with based on cost, their expected impact, as well as risks like negative externalities and possible spillover effects, and then choosing the right kinds of tests or experiments. Not just seeing what works, but trying to understand the user, or in this case, the recipient of the aid program. And there are a lot of different methods we could have chosen to address this challenge. And this slide here outlines some of the different common methods that behavioral scientists use. In this project, I focused on three. So I focused on user interviews, a quantitative survey, and an in-field experiment. I'm going to walk you through each of these and what we did and what we learned. So we started with qualitative interviews. We did semi-structured interviews and something called Windfall vignettes, which I'll tell you about. And then we ran a quantitative survey with 1,500 people. We asked people to fill out detailed time diaries, asking about how they spent their day from hour to hour. We asked about income and their spending, as well as the contributors to stress and well-being. And these first two methods were intended to understand the context. And then in the field experiment, we took the insights and designed a randomized controlled trial to test a new model of economic assistance based on freeing up people's time. So I'm going to walk through each of these and what we learned. So we started off with the qualitative research phase, and we recruited residents of Kibera who had received economic assistance within the past month. And here we pulled from a representative sample of 30,000 residents. We randomly drew from this pool so we wouldn't have any selection biases. And we asked them about their time use, control over their time. We asked them about their income and expense fluctuations, the sources of stress in their life. And then we used these windfall vignettes where we gave people a scenario and asked them to think about how they would respond. So for instance, we asked them, if you had an unexpected school fee, how would you fit this into your budget? How would it affect your life? What factors would you need to consider? And then similarly, we asked them, imagine you received a free prepared meal service for a week. How might this affect your life? What would you have to do now that you didn't have to purchase meals for a week? So these windfalls help us think through their decision process, how they think through problems of shortfalls and windfalls. So here's what we learned. One big core theme that stood out from all of these interviews that we conducted was poverty is episodic. A lot of researchers and policymakers tend to think of poverty as a chronic, static state. But our participants talked a lot about falling in and out of poverty. They had really volatile income streams and really volatile working schedules and unpredictable expenses. Another big theme was time poverty. This goes to the assumption that people living in financial poverty must have idle time. People often have in their mind somebody who's unemployed, right? So low on cash, but they've got a lot of time at their disposal. Now, for this population, we found that people were very time constrained, especially working mothers. So we followed up with a large-scale quantitative survey with 1,200 participants. In this case, we focused specifically on working mothers, the population that is likely to be simultaneously cash poor and time poor. Here I'm showing you some basic demographics, but I just want to direct your attention to one interesting fact. A lot of these people were micro-entrepreneurs. So if you look on the right side of your screen, you can see 32% of the overall sample of 1,200 people were micro-entrepreneurs, meaning their primary source of income was a business that they owned, for instance, selling produce or clothing, a small-scale restaurant, things like that. So we analyzed the data from the survey that we ran with these folks, and we found that this population is really financially constrained. So they earn a median of 1,400 Kenyan shillings per week, which is about $14 US. And also the median household savings balance was $0. So most of these households are living paycheck to paycheck with no safety net. They're exposed to a lot of risk. They have unstable jobs, minimal access to credit, and a lot of health risks in this area. So you can see that this population is very financially constrained. We also find that they're very time constrained. So here I'm showing the weekly hours of paid labor as well as the weekly hours of unpaid labor. So at the median here, we see that people do 45 hours of paid labor and 36 hours of unpaid labor on average per week. So this is a lot of time spent on unpaid labor. So this is not an instance of people being cash poor and time rich. We then zeroed in specifically on micro-entrepreneurs because we thought this group might be especially time constrained. And we find that's the case, right? So if you look on the left here, you can see all other occupations compared against entrepreneurs. And you can see that entrepreneurs are doing about 50 hours of paid labor per week compared to 42 for people in all other occupations. And they're doing a little bit less unpaid labor, but overall their total burden of paid and unpaid labor is very, very high. So 91 hours per week on average for micro-entrepreneurs. Next, we wanted to analyze how these financial and temporal constraints contribute to feelings of stress. So we took the gold standard measure of stress, which is the PSS, the perceived stress scale. And stress is a really tricky thing to measure. And a lot of the time we think of this really broad, ill-defined measure. This scale really focuses on a specific aspect of stress. We think of stress as a feeling of control over the important events in your life. And what we find, not surprisingly, is that as people earn more money, stress goes down, right? And then we also looked at it, looking at the plotting perceived stress against hours of unpaid labor, again, using what we call a local regression approach, a low S regression. And here we find that more time spent on unpaid labor is associated with higher levels of stress, but this is a bit of a weaker association. So the next thing we did is a multiple regression approach to examine the contributors to stress in this population. So again, the outcome variable is this measure of perceived stress, PSS. And we look at the different predictors, including total earnings, time use broken into 4 categories: unpaid labor, paid labor, active leisure, and passive leisure. And we measure time use as a percentage of total time. So here people were filling out time diaries, telling us how they spent their hour to hour. And not everybody reported the exact same amount of time. So the best way to measure this is like the percentage of their total reported time that they spent on a given activity. And I mentioned this detail just because there's almost no time use data on people living in these informal settlements in poor countries. People in the United States, there's something called the American Time Use Survey. The same thing is true in Australia and Germany and the UK. Our governments conduct time use surveys asking about how people spend their time. And if you go to developing countries, we have a very limited understanding of how they're spending their time. So this research was one of the first to do detailed hour-to-hour, day-to-day assessments of how people are spending their time. And here I want to just highlight 2 results. And what we find standing out here is that first, earnings has a strong association with stress, even after controlling for differences in time use. And then second, active leisure seems to be a really important contributor to stress. So active leisure is defined as leisure outside of the home, and that's primarily socializing. So what we find here is that when people have less time for active leisure, they're more stressed, right? And it's kind of interesting finding, these are people who are, again, living on $2 a day, but we don't want to underestimate the importance of active leisure. Here, socializing is a really important factor in making sure these people aren't too stressed. So recapping these results here, a key finding is that working mothers are both financially constrained and time constrained. And we wanted to test whether alleviating some of these time constraints could be an effective method of improving economic and psychological well-being. So in the experiment, I randomly assigned working mothers to receive cash transfers, which accounted for a 43% bump in their income on average for 3 weeks, or what I'm going to call time transfers, where we freed up 15 to 21 hours of unpaid labor over 3 weeks here. And I'm just going to pause here and see if anybody has any questions about the results I've presented so far, or any predictions about, okay, if I give people a 43% cash boost or a 15 to 21 hour time boost, which one is going to be more impactful on their well-being, both psychological well-being and economic well-being? So I'll pause here. Does anybody want to have any questions they want to either throw in the chat or come off mute?
Yeah, Armand is raising his hand. Armand, can you come off mute? Brad, do we know if Armand can come off mute?
Hello, hello.
Oh, there he is. Cool, cool. And then Mateo, you're next. Go ahead, Armand.
I actually don't have a question, but I just wanted to notify that the chat is disabled, and I think we could see through the Q&A section that maybe people are trying to input their provide some input through the chat.
Thank you for the heads up. Brad's on the back end ops there, so we'll clear that up. But we do see That's cool, though. We do see things going in the Q&A. So thank you, Armand. Then to Matteo, go ahead. Matteo, are you able to unmute? Oh, I think we have to.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Oh,
We do.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Well, it just got my interest that the time spent on unpaid activities is almost the same of the amount of time spent on paid activities. I was curious about if you got any deeper information about how come if the time is almost the same, how come people don't have don't give time the same value than money?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fundamental question here. So Matteo points out that people spend almost as much time on unpaid labor on average per week as they do on paid labor. So one way that you could avoid that is to outsource. We all do that in our lives. We buy a meal, we do takeaway, right, rather than cooking. Perhaps you have somebody, you rather than taking the subway to work, you jump in an Uber, you go faster, right? All of the time we think about outsourcing chores. It's a common way that we free up our unpaid labor. And the question I think there is, well, why aren't people valuing their time more and outsourcing, paying people to do the chores for them, for instance? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is a market failure in this area. We looked at the availability of time-saving services in Kibera. And if you wanted to have somebody do your laundry for you or cook for you, it's really expensive here, especially when you're living on $2 a day. So one is just access to time-saving service. And the other here is that when we asked people to place a value on their time, here we asked people, how long would you be willing to wait, to get an extra hour of labor, right? How long would you be willing to wait for, a cash transfer of this size? And there's ways that you can measure the value that people place on their time. And people living in poverty tend to place a very low value on their time. Understandably, their attention is focused on their financial constraints, and they think less about their temporal constraints. And that's also the true of policymakers, that I showed that pilot study with the Masters of Public Policy students from Harvard Kennedy School. We tend to narrow our focus on material constraints and undervalue time constraints. So that's part of what we wanted to study was, does this make sense, focusing our attention on material constraints? Are they really more important than time constraints? And what happens if we do free up? So I'll dive into a little bit deeper there, but I think your intuitions are on the mark there about, look how much unpaid labor people are doing and how can we find ways to reduce that.
Hey, Colin, we're gonna, Sam had a quick question and then Jeremy did as well. So Sam,
yes,
I think
I see Sam's and Brad posted that in the chat. That is the crux of the experiment. So I'm going to hold off on showing you that just now, because that is a critical part of this. It's how do you give people time? That's easier said than done. Giving away money, very straightforward. Giving away time, not so straightforward. So that's one that I'm gonna show you just a few slides.
cool. And then Jeremy, what was your question?
Couple of little questions. When you say paid versus unpaid labor for a micro entrepreneur, I'm kind of a micro entrepreneur. I run a small consultancy. It's kind of hard to tell what I'm doing throughout the day that is like paid versus unpaid, in the sense that how do you divide those tasks? Is cleaning the shop unpaid labor because it doesn't relate to sales directly, or is anything that has to do with the shop paid labor, and then, for instance, work in the home considered unpaid labor?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's a number of ways to measure time use. And the gold standard of that is something called the day reconstruction method. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, Nobel Prize winner in behavioral economics. He came up with the day reconstruction method, which is a way of categorizing your time use into different buckets and thinking of them, your day, as different episodes or scenes in a movie is the way he describes it. You know, you think of, okay, we're on this call right now. This is one episode, right? And then the next, you're gonna, go have lunch, or you're gonna have a call, another call for work. That's another episode. So we ask people to divide their day into different episodes. They can be 5-minute one where you're on a phone call, or they can be 3 hours where you're working, for instance, and then categorize that into common categories that we observe that from many, many surveys all over the world, we create these different buckets. And it's your own subjective assessment is the short answer to that question, is if you categorize that as unpaid labor, then it's how you define your time use, right? So and I think that's an important distinction of we as the researcher aren't imposing this on you, you're defining your own time use. But I mean, I think the answer to your question, if you're sweeping up a store, that counts as paid labor, right? If you're sweeping up your own home, that would be unpaid labor.
Excellent.
Okay, but people self-determine in the study.
Yes, so if you look up further, the day reconstruction method is the method that we use here, and people divide their time into episodes and self-categorize.
Gotcha. Okay, another quick question, or I think it's quick. Doesn't outsourcing incur a kind of like time risk? So I work with a lot of contractors, and I can tell you that managing a contractor isn't I hand off a task and then I go, never think about it again. If the contractor messes up, then it can take me double the time that it took me to have done it myself. And so isn't it more complicated to outsource a task than to just assume that that's a one-to-one supplanting of the entrepreneurs doing the task themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there's actually some types of outsourcing doesn't involve much risk, right? You do a takeout meal rather than cook for yourself. Not a huge amount of risk there. But as you point out, for sometimes if you're outsourcing work tasks, absolutely, yeah, you incur some risk there. But there is good research, even from my collaborator in this, Ashley Willens at Harvard Business School, looking at entrepreneurs not outsourcing soon enough. So yes, you incur some risk. But when do you hire, an administrative assistant? When do you make your first hire, second hire? And there's good research working with a lot of VCs showing that entrepreneurs often delay too long. Right. So maybe they're thinking about the risks. Maybe they're thinking, hey, I need to be involved in every little aspect. But if you look at entrepreneurs that tend to outsource sooner, tend to outperform those that don't. Right. So yes, I think the short answer is yes, there is some risk depending on what you outsource. But a lot of entrepreneurs have a bias towards not outsourcing soon enough.
That's fascinating, and I think really cool because you're also getting to all the applications of this beyond the experiment. So carry on. We want to see what the next scene in the movie is. What is better, time or money? What's more important? Take it away.
Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the design here of this experiment. Right, so we had 1,550 employed mothers living in Busara as our study participants, and we randomly assigned them to one of three conditions in a randomized control trial. And the three conditions were a control condition where participants received small cash transfers, compensation for completing our survey measures, equaling $2.50 per week, which was an 18% income boost. The other condition was a financial windfall condition where they received larger cash transfers, $6 per week, a 43% income boost, or a time windfall condition. And we oversampled the time windfall condition to look at heterogeneous treatment effects, which I'll show you later. And let me get to the question from Sam about, well, how do we give a time windfall? Right? This is a really critical question. And we went back to our quantitative survey here, and we looked at the details on how people spent their time on unpaid labor. And these were categories in our time use survey that people spent on unpaid labor. And you can see that two stand out here. Cooking and laundry are very large categories of unpaid labor. On the right side of your screen, this is a photo of the typical method of doing laundry in Kibera. It's by hand. It involves people washing everything by hand and then often waiting around while their clothing dries so that it's not taken. So they have to walk to a place where there is running water because they usually don't have it in their household. They have to wash by hand and then wait there. So it's a very time-consuming method of doing laundry. So that's what we chose. We chose these two methods here of providing time windfalls. Now we've got a control condition, a financial windfall condition, and a time windfall condition where we provided people with either a laundry or a prepared meal service once per week for 3 consecutive weeks. And on average, this saved people about 5 to 7 hours per week. We did this from a centralized location here in the center of Kibera. And we wanted to do this by using a central location so that we didn't impose time costs on people while we're trying to save them time here. So the Kibera Town Center is operated by the Human Needs Project. It's right in the heart of Kibera, through a major throughway that people pass to go in and out to work. So it's very convenient for them to come to the center. And here's a basic schematic of the study timeline. So we recruited people in week 0. We did a baseline survey at the Kibera Town Center. They received the treatments, so either the cash windfalls or the time windfalls for 3 weeks, and then we followed up with an end-line survey. And here are the results. One really important big first question is, how do people use these unexpected windfalls of time? What do they do with them? And we find a couple interesting results here. So the first thing we find is that the total amount of time that people spend on labor actually increases in response to time windfalls. So it's partly due to paid labor and partly due to unpaid labor. So, we're providing people with time windfalls by doing some unpaid labor for them, and they respond by actually doing more unpaid labor over the course of this study. So, perhaps they were doing some unpaid labor that they were putting off. And they also spent more time on paid labor. They might have taken this as an opportunity to work more and earn more money. The other big thing that we find is that we see a decrease in the amount of time people spent on leisure. So this is surprising, right? So think about what this means. We provided people with some extra time by reducing their burden of unpaid labor, and they actually spent less time on leisure activities compared to their normal day-to-day time use and compared to the control condition, as you can see here. So the amount of time spent on passive leisure was quite flat, but people in the time-saving condition spent less time on active leisure throughout the treatment weeks there. And this is a really important finding because we saw that active leisure is an important way to reduce stress. Remember from the quantitative survey, in our multiple regression model, that spending more time on active leisure was associated with less stress, even after controlling for differences in income. So why might people have reduced their active leisure? Well, we know in Kibera that there are strong moral and social norms about spending time productively. So people might have felt an obligation to use these windfalls of time on productive activities, which might explain why they spent more time on labor and less time on leisure. Okay, another big question. We just looked at how people spent the time. How do they spend the cash? And a common criticism of cash transfer programs around the world is this idea that people will spend the money frivolously. What we find here is that people spend the money mostly productively and on basic necessities. So here in green, we're comparing the financial windfall, how people are spending money in that condition against the control condition where people are receiving small windfalls. Right? And what we find here is that the biggest categories are food and groceries. And then business inputs is a big one as well. A lot of people put this money directly into their business. School fees is a big one. That's one of the biggest expenses that people face. They often save up a lot to be able to pay their kids' school fees. So these are pretty practical necessities and productive ways of allocating the cash transfers. Next, we wanted to look at the effects on perceived stress. And this is one of the key findings because we think perceived stress is this really important indicator of psychological well-being as well as future economic well-being. And here we found a really interesting result. Here I'm showing you the effects on perceived stress for each condition over the course of the experiment here. And what we find is that they track pretty closely, right? So we do this using a Bayesian ANCOVA, where you look at the expected versus observed differences by condition. And we see this U-shaped pattern across each of the different conditions, right? So we see that stress declines when we start providing people with windfalls of cash or windfalls of time, and it goes back up at the end, but not all the way to baseline, right? So even at end line, we see that there's a substantial reduction in perceived stress. So all of these seem to have some benefits here. We wanted to zoom in and look at some of these different effects. So the next thing we looked at was earnings, right? Because we were looking at micro entrepreneurs here, and we wanted to look at how that affected how much money they earn. So first, I'm going to show you everybody in our study here. And here's what we find. We find slightly higher earnings for people in the time-saving condition, right? So we've given people extra time, and they go out and they often spend it really productively, earning more money. Now, if we look at this just for micro entrepreneurs, this is a particularly interesting one. So this is the subset of people in our study, 441 people who their primary source of income is a business that they own. And here we see that people who got the time windfall earned the most, even out earning those who received the cash windfall that they also injected into their business, right? So here was a really interesting comparison. You got micro entrepreneurs and you provide them with a windfall of money. They can go out and buy inventory. They could outsource some tasks. They could hire people to help them. Then another group we randomly assigned to receive a windfall of time, and they can inject that time into their business. And what we found here was that at end line, the micro entrepreneurs who received time out-earned those that received cash. Okay, so let's just step back and think a little bit about the impact of this kind of research. So firstly, our goal was to think about a new model of economic assistance, thinking about programs specifically designed to save people time. That when we looked at the programs that existed in this, across the world in economic assistance programs, very few were really focused on saving people time. And then the second is thinking about reducing time costs in existing aid programs. A lot of aid programs are costing the recipients time, and these results suggest that they might be undermining their own effectiveness. And then secondly, an important takeaway from this is that we need to measure time costs and time savings in our impact evaluations. We think that time poverty, how much time people are spending on paid and unpaid labor, and how stressed they're feeling, how busy they're feeling, is a really important leading indicator of whether they're going to have an opportunity for economic advancement. And it's something that we should measure when we're evaluating whether a given program is working or not. And then also, reducing time poverty, I think, should be a goal in and of itself. Part of what we care about for well-being is having some discretionary time at our disposal. And I think that should be an end that charities care about, not just the material constraints that people are facing. So a few takeaways here from this research. I want to focus on, a lot of us here work in tech, and we think about the future of digital tools. An important takeaway that over the next 5 years, another 1 billion people are going to gain access to the internet for the first time. And a lot of these users are going to look like the working mothers that were part of the studies that I just presented. These new users are going to be both financially and time poor. And it's our job as product builders to design for these kinds of constraints. And one important way to do this is to build tools that can help people use their windfalls of time and money more wisely. So no matter how financially constrained or temporally constrained we all experience windfalls of time and money throughout our lives. And it's critical that we recognize these windfall moments and use them wisely. So with that, I'll conclude and encourage all of you to use your windfalls wisely.
Oh, thank you so much, Colin. I was typing an answer to something in the chat there, but I'll actually let you take it. Jeremy said, comparing the behavior of venture-backed entrepreneurs to Kibera-based micro-entrepreneurs is pretty specious. Your hot take on that? Because I was about to give my hot take, but I was like, whatever, I can give it to you.
Yeah, I'm not comparing them. This was focused on specifically on micro entrepreneurs in developing country settings. That's what this research is trying to do.
I was responding to another comment in the chat that was quoting that said venture capitalists often advise startups to outsource for it. Yes, I wasn't responding to.
Yeah, I think that's a separate issue and an interesting one. That there's some interesting work from Ashley at Harvard Business School or Olaf Sorensen at UCLA, where I did my PhD, looking at now these are like Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, when they should start outsourcing. I think that's a really interesting question on the same topic as, thinking about time use for micro entrepreneurs. Yes, but certainly we wouldn't want to draw too many comparisons between, think of who is in my study, right? These are working mothers earning an average of $2 a day, right? Their lives are very different from people working in Silicon Valley. But I think when you think about the future of tech products, now, as I mentioned, all these folks are getting internet access. They earn $2 a day, but they have smartphones, right? So I actually think it's a really interesting challenge for a lot of tech companies is how do we build products for people, for micro entrepreneurs living on $2 a day? And since the beginning of the internet, you needed to be, have more money in order to have internet access. And all of a sudden, just over the last few years, internet access and smartphone access is getting much, much cheaper. So there's actually a really interesting question of like, for us working in Silicon Valley and in tech, how do we think about building products for these folks, right? So yeah, let's not compare them, but now these are internet users too. And I think that's a really interesting population for us to think about. How can we build products for them from a philanthropic standpoint? But also, these are going to be the customers of, big tech and small tech.
Yeah, and just to dovetail that, Jeremy, I was pasting information on Ashley's research and then pulling that quote that Colin had talked about. That said, and I think, Colin, you can speak to this, time is a constant variable in the human condition. So while contexts will vary and results will vary, general principles are emerging on time use, right?
Yeah, and I'll say one other reason why it's interesting to study this population is, imagine if I tried to run this study, in the United States. This would be tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Whereas here, people living on $2 a day, I can provide pretty substantial windfalls of time or money, right? So then if we think about just kind of the human condition of facing shortfalls and windfalls of time and money, doing research in these populations allow us to inject large resources into their lives and observe the differences, right? So it's often a good place to start, and I know there are some, think of like universal basic income, for instance. There's been pilot projects in Stockton, California, and Southern Ontario as well that are trying to look at the effects of it. Often, a lot of those UBI programs are based on research that started off in East Africa, just because it's more feasible to be able to run those studies.
Yeah, and I should note, anybody really interested in time scarcity, emotional scarcity, or economic scarcity should read the book Scarcity. So I pasted information on that in the chat. And it's also kind of listed as one of our 10 most influential books in behavioral economics.
Yeah, and I'll mention like that was a lot of what inspired this work. Sandhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir from UChicago and Princeton, respectively, they had this amazing research on how living in financial scarcity affects our decision making. Now they focus on financial scarcity explicitly. And part of this research is to look at, well, if we look at our effects on decision making, how does time scarcity differ from financial scarcity? And I think we've shown there are some ways that it's different, but some ways that it's similar as well. They both contribute to stress, but people tend to undervalue their resources of time more than their resources of money.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think also your research and their research is so important because it really deconstructs these myths about poverty, right? Because of tunnel vision, people really, people make all these assumptions about what poor people aren't doing. And in actuality, they're doing quite a lot, right?
Yeah, and I think a big takeaway too is just actually paying attention to people's time use, right? The first step just goes to, when you're running a large-scale economic assistance program, people's time is a really important consideration that even really well-intentioned programs like the Gates Foundation, the World Bank, weren't measuring how they're influencing people's time, right? And as I said, not only is time a really important factor if people are going to advance economically, but I think it's also just important in and of itself, right? If you've got people who are really cash poor and really time poor, that's a stressful situation and something that we, when we design economic aid programs, we want to think about.
There are 2 quick Q&As in the chat. Are you able to just field those 2 and then we'll call it a day?
So the first one here, what about direct benefit transfers where cash windfall gets directly leading to so these were digital cash transfers, right? So the pervading mobile money system in Kenya is called M-Pesa. Nearly everyone has M-Pesa. So we gave these cash transfers digitally. So they did not impose any time costs. But you make a great point. A lot of cash transfer programs around the world do not use digital transfers. You have to go to like food stamps, for instance, you have to go to like particular stores to use them, or even other cash transfers. You can only go to certain ATMs or something. They actually impose a lot of time costs when they're giving away cash. In this case, we didn't. Digital automatic transfers with no transaction fees. And then the second question here, okay. The best way to ask time poor people for time. What's the best way to ask time poor people for time? We want to give them time, not ask for their time. And what's the trade-off between doing something in person, which takes more time, versus doing it remotely? Yeah. So I think, that's a huge issue, right? Of time savings versus the benefits you get. Now, all I would say is that let's just try to measure this a little bit better. This is what my, a big thing that I talk about is, including time and cost benefit analyses. If we're going to require people to come into the office, you should think about, okay, are we getting a creativity or productivity bump as a result of doing that? If you don't measure it, then we don't know. So I think, that's a trade-off that you mentioned, Doran, and something that we should think about. And the way to do that is to measure time use more effectively.
Wow, lots of great questions. I have one last question for you, Colin. Do Canadians call it take home instead of take out?
Take out, take away. Did I say take home?
Away? Yeah, you said, oh, some people order takeaway. And I was like, oh, I'd never heard that turn of phrase.
It might just be a Colinism, not a Canadianism.
Oh, okay, cool. I just wanted to check, just so that way when I crossed the border, I was speaking proper English,
You'll be fine.
Okay, good. They won't boot me out of the country. Well, listen, Colin, thank you so much for your time.